Hello and welcome. In this video, I wanted to share with you my first impressions of Winsor & Newton Designer's gouache. I've never used gouache before, and this is truly my first impression of gouache in general. Since I have used watercolor, it was pretty approachable and more or less easy to control. I think that in the first couple of squares, I used a little bit too much of the paint. So you can see that it's a little bit of a heavy, thick layer, and it took the paint a little bit longer to dry. I also think that it's better to put a thinner layer down because if you do want to go back over that layer with an additional color, then you don't want the bottom layer, which is dried, to be picked up when you apply the second layer. And so in the next squares, I tried to use less paint. It was pretty easy to get these opaque and more or less uniform squares. I wasn't being very meticulous, so my squares aren't perfect and I have a little bit of dry brush and wonky corners, but for the purpose of just trying out gouache for the first time and playing around with the colors, this was all I intended to do, and that was fine for me. The white that I have is zinc white. Zinc white isn't the most opaque white, and so you can see that it looks a little bit milky when applied over other colors. I think that it would be better that I get an actual opaque white. The reason I didn't get the primary white by Winsor & Newton, I also didn't get the primary blue, is because these specific gouache paints by Winsor & Newton are not vegan friendly, and so I chose an alternative. Instead of primary blue, I got phthalo blue. So you can see I'm experimenting with layering darker or lighter colors over the colors that have already dried, and they do dry pretty fast. The colors are really strong, really vibrant, as can be expected. I've heard only great things about Winsor & Newton artist grade gouache and also artist grade gouache by other manufacturers. At some point I decided I'd try to mix up a lot of different colors to see what colors I can come up with. I also tried making some of the colors lighter by adding a lot of white or just adding a touch of color to white. My palette got pretty messy in this experiment. I wasn't being very meticulous about having a methodical, nice, organized palette. It's just a mess of jumbled up colors. I chose to get traditional gouache as opposed to the acrylic-based gouache because once the traditional gouache dries in your palette, you can reactivate it with water and reuse it. So you don't really have to clean out your palette. You can just add some water and you can reuse your paints just like you can with watercolor. So that's one of the main differences between traditional gouache and acrylic-based gouache, like Holbein Acryla. I have heard a lot of good things about the Holbein Acryla gouache, and maybe I will get that gouache too one day, but for my first ever gouache, I chose to get the traditional gouache. As I was making these squares, I thought that it would be really fun to maybe actually have a plan in mind and to try and carry out that plan. I mean, normally I just pick up my paintbrush and paint, and what I get is usually abstract stuff like doodles or abstract geometric designs or organic shapes just fitting in together. I think that this is an opportunity for me to try and plan something, maybe even a two-dimensional design, but have it more planned out rather than just letting whatever emerge. I still love doodling and I plan to keep doodling, but kind of feel like maybe trying something more with a plan in mind. And maybe I'll get to making more figurative drawings, not necessarily looking like real life, but more illustrative. We'll see if I'll be able to come up with something for that. Towards the end, I thought I could try blending these colors. If you're used to watercolor pretty much blends itself. I guess you do have to control it in some way so that it'll blend nicely, but when you put two wet patches of watercolor next to each other, they pretty much blend into each other. With gouache, the gouache just sits there. It's heavier than watercolor and it doesn't want to flow into each other so easily. So you need to help it along, but it was pretty easy to blend it, really. It's hard for me to say how I would have felt using gouache if I hadn't ever used watercolor, but it seems to me that gouache is a lot easier than watercolor in the sense of just using it for the first time. I think that watercolor is a lot more unpredictable. It does all kinds of things that you need to play around with it before you understand where it's going and why it's doing what it's doing. I think with gouache, it's more of a straightforward paint. It likes to sit on the paper. This was a really great experiment, trying out gouache for the first time. I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Leave a thumbs up if you did, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already done so, and I'll see you in the next one.